Hello, and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This video is another in my Pulp Adventures series where I get to talk about fantastic Pulp era stories or Pulp characters or other stories that I've gotten the chance to read or stumbled across. And for this one, I'm going to be talking once again about the iconic fox himself, the legendary character of Zorro, created by Johnston McCulley in 1919 in The Curse of Capistrano, more famously known as The Mark of Zorro, as retitled for the 1920 Douglas Fairbanks Sr. masterpiece silent film, The Mark of Zorro, which was, of course, another landmark in what eventually became superhero stories and the superhero genre, of which Zorro is one of the primary founding characters. There were characters in existence, especially in other countries, before Zorro and other characters such as the Scarlet Pimpernel. So there were always precursors, as there are with most anything. But it's really Johnston McCulley, I think, in writing the Zorro character that really kind of cemented a lot of these elements, especially in American pop culture and people's minds, and in terms of cementing the ideas of a masked avenger and somebody who has a dual identity that he has to keep secret, and fighting for justice and against corrupt officials, and so on and so forth. And also you get the magical sort of appeal of it being set in the past and in the West. So I think it's important to note any of the great Zorro stories as also great westerns. That's also part of the fascination and never-ending charm of the Zorro canon. And if you've never read Johnston McCulley's Zorro stories, you really should, because they're some of the most important fiction really ever. And I think everybody should at least read The Mark of Zorro once. But thankfully, you can also turn to wonderful reprints to read the other incredible short stories McCulley did write extensively about Zorro over the years. And you can actually read the entire canon in the wonderful Bold Venture Press 6-volume reprint series. But today I'm talking about the lovely newspaper strip, which ran in 1999 or so, and was around the time that the character was in people's minds again and in popular consciousness because of the success of the Mask of Zorro film in 1998. There had also been a nice resurgence in Zorro stories in the comic realm a little bit before that. This was sort of, I think, sparked off by the television series of Zorro that had started in and around the late 80s, and then we saw a number of comics released, first from Marvel, actually, who did a nice Zorro run that was tied to that television series, and then it switched over to Topps Comics, and we saw a variety of comics and other side characters that were spawned out of that run. So there was actually quite a bit of new Zorro material before we even had the Mask of Zorro, and I think most people are probably not aware of that. I think most people think of Zorro not really being adapted or really even referenced for a great number of decades before the 1998 film, but there was actually a nice little bit of comic material. And a good number of these were written by Don McGregor, who was basically tapped to write a new newspaper comic strip of Zorro adventures. So these were done for 2 years, and the first year is collected in this lovely volume that is literally entitled Zorro, the Dailies, the First Year. And it's nicely put together by Image as a lovely wide book printing that is designed to give you the feel and the correct alignment and spacing for the actual newspaper strips, which of course would run more horizontally. So this is like most newspaper strip reprints that you find in terms of these nice publishers who are doing this a lot of times. So it's a book that's kind of a bit bigger in terms of dimensions, so it's a little bit harder to fit on a bookshelf, but that's because it's reprinting an entire year of newspaper strip stories. Now, the Zorro tales in this volume ran from April 1999 to April 2000, so it's literally the first year. Unfortunately, the second year was not published. It was announced, apparently, but it doesn't seem to have been printed, and they may have done a limited run of both years, but it seems that only this first year volume that I found is the version you can actually get a physical copy of, which is a shame because the two story arcs here are quite good and nicely done. And this is a nice volume. So you get the nice spine, nice rear cover. But what's also nice about this is you get a lot of nice imagery. Again, really using the width to give you the great appeal of reading a newspaper strip and allowing the art to breathe. But there's also a nice introduction that also talks about how the strip was designed and carried off, and about how they were still having to do this and having to just FedEx pages and panels back and forth. But it was a challenge for everybody involved because they weren't necessarily used to newspaper strips, which also had to be delivered on time, and you had to serialize the story. And that's probably the one area that you're going to definitely have a quibble with about this particular run of Zorro stories. Again, this is a book of the first year, and it's merely 2 stories. They kind of run into each other, so there's a little connection, but they're basically 2 individual story arcs. So the first is entitled Tusk Envy, and that runs for the first 75 pages. And then the rest and the majority of the book is the second story arc, which is Dead Body Rising. And, reading these back to back, and the fact that they were done, back to back across a whole year, the first very much flows into the second. But the real issue with this, in terms of telling any story in this form, is you have to continually do each day or each week. Every time somebody comes to the strip for the first time, you do have to have a little bit of exposition so they can just pick up and be able to figure out what's going on. So there's a little bit of repetition in that sense. But also, because these stories ran for a whole year, it does really mean that we get a lot of individual moments and nuance for scenes, so they do kind of feel a little bit stretched out. But of course, these weren't meant to be read consecutively through each and every day of the daily strip. So, there's a degree of being able to sort of understand that, you're not supposed to exactly read this in one go. It's like watching a classic cliffhanger serial. They weren't designed to be watched in their entirety. So, you're supposed to watch maybe a couple chapters at a time, not all 12 or 15 chapters in one go, or you'll drive yourself nuts. So with any newspaper strip, you're going to have some degree of that. So it's probably best to read them in nice bursts. But the 2 stories here, I think, are good, and they also have a bit of the grit that you get more of in Macaulay's stories versus some of the Zorro adaptations being a little less pulpy. For example, in Macaulay's stories, Zorro frequently leaves his mark not by just carving a Z. He usually carves it in the enemy's flesh and leaves his actual mark for all time. So that's just an example of how the original Macaulay stories are a little bit pulpier, in terms of the grit and some of the darker and nastier aspects that you would find throughout pulp era fiction. And there are some dark elements in these stories, and they aren't afraid to go into those darker elements, which is nice and befitting of it being a newspaper strip from 1999 as opposed to decades beforehand. The artwork is quite nice, and the layout is well done, and you get the actual date for each strip, so you're able to actually follow along. And of course, the Sundays are the bigger and more expanded upon. So for example, here we have the previous 2 days, and then the right page is the Sunday strip, which of course is bigger, more detailed, and has more story, because the Sundays would be the more elaborate and bigger versions. So again, the printing is really well done, and of course this was a black and white strip, so it's of course reproduced in black and white here. And I really enjoyed reading these. Of the 2 arcs, the second, of course because it's much longer, is the more developed of the 2, but they very much flow into each other, and once you start reading this, you really have to finish it. But again, because of the nature of daily newspaper strips, it's probably best to read this in short bursts. But again, you can do like I did and just get hooked into it and read the whole thing, start to finish. But again, there is going to be some repetition. But if you've read and enjoyed any of Don McGregor's Zorro comics, this is just a natural must. If you love the character, this is a fantastic bit of Zorro material. And again, I wasn't even aware there had actually been a Zorro newspaper strip, because you don't even think of newspaper comic strips all that much, especially after a certain point. But they did continue, and they still do continue. Thankfully, some of the legends still run. The Phantom strip still runs in newspapers around the world. Unfortunately, not really supported here in America all that much. But there are some that still keep the torch burning and the flag waving. But it's just fascinating to look at this Zorro strip. I just wish that second year was in a matching volume. So all you can do is find this first year in this lovely printing, and there are some nice bonus interviews and extras. It's also usually very cheap. I found this in my local comic shop for about $5, so I had to pick it up, and I just devoured it. So if you're a Zorro fan or you love Zorro in comics, this is an absolute must. So this is just another of my forays into the printed world of Zorro, one of the great heroes of fiction. And the various Zorro comics over the years are an aspect of the character that just isn't really discussed all that often. I've read a number of them, and the Zorro comics are some of the few I actively try to collect. I don't really collect a lot of comics, but the ones that I do, it's usually the pulp characters that I love so much that I just want to read their comic adventures as well. And unfortunately, they're usually not all collected, and they bounced around to different publishers. For example, the early '90s Marvel and Topps comics have not really been collected, so you have to get individual issues. And so I've read a number of those, and also some of the sporadic Zorro printed fiction, like the couple of Zorro novels that were done after the Mask of Zorro film. So stumbling across this copy of the first year of a Zorro newspaper strip was an absolute must. And again, bringing over the same writer who wrote the best 1990s Zorro comics was the perfect choice. And so if you've ever enjoyed those, this is a must. Or if you enjoy this, I think those other comics are an absolute must. So this is just another bit of me digging into Zorro lore, who is a character I've been fascinated with ever since I was a little kid and first encountered the incredible, majestic masterpiece Disney television series from the 1950s with Guy Williams, which is still my favorite and I think the definitive Zorro in terms of film adaptations. But I've just been fascinated by the character, and slowly but surely I'm working my way through trying to read every bit and last scrap of Zorro fiction there is, because he is one of the great characters of all of fiction and literature, and really the originator of a lot of what people take for granted in terms of the superhero genre. So as always, I hope my babblings about Zorro and pulp fiction and adventure fiction and comics have been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you're curious about this lovely release of the first year of the Zorro newspaper strips, it was published by Image. It is very affordable. You can usually get a copy on eBay for less than $10 or so. Sometimes it's available on Amazon. It's just unfortunate that this is just half of the 2-year run. So I don't know if anybody's done like a fan collection or if that second year is floating around somewhere, but at least you can get this lovely first year of stories, which is really well done and very fun to read for a very cheap price, and a really nice, well done edition that also preserves the original layout. So I strongly recommend this to any fan of Zorro, or anyone who loves Zorro comics or Zorro fiction outside of the films, and anyone who's just looking for a great pulp adventure. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent comic stores and bookstores by looking for incredible pulp adventure fun, and also helping to keep them in business. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.